Let's be honest, Scott Keller said, smiling as if he were trying to be helpful. You're just a pretty face. We can find someone else for the technical parts. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look angry. He said it the way people say things when they're certain there will be no consequences. The room stayed quiet for a moment. Someone shifted in their chair. Someone else cleared their throat. Then the meeting moved on, as if nothing unusual had been said. My name is Lena Ross. At the time, I worked at Ravenport Technologies, a company known for its enterprise infrastructure platform. I had been there long enough that most people associated the system with the company itself, not with any individual. Scott had joined the firm after his father stepped back from daily operations. His title changed quickly, his authority even faster. 2 days after that meeting, I received an email from HR asking me to come in at 10 o'clock a.m. Scott was already there when I arrived, sitting comfortably, scrolling through his phone. The HR manager read from a prepared document. There was no accusation, no criticism, just a clean sentence delivered without emotion. Due to restructuring, your position has been eliminated. I asked one question. Is this effective immediately? Yes, she said. Your access will be revoked by the end of the day. I signed where they indicated. I handed over my badge. Scott didn't say a word. Back at my desk, people avoided eye contact. A few whispered apologies that didn't change anything. Security waited near the elevators while I packed my bag. By late afternoon, my email logged out. Internal tools followed. The system I'd worked with for years no longer recognized me. That evening, at home, I opened an old folder I hadn't touched in a long time. Inside were early contracts, design notes, and one patent filing from before Ravenport had investors, before Scott Keller had ever walked into the building. The company had been using that patent under a licensing agreement tied directly to my employment. And according to the termination paperwork I'd signed that morning, my employment had ended immediately, which meant the license had ended too. Before we go on, check in with me for a moment. How are you feeling right now, if you can? Close your eyes briefly and listen to the quietest sound around you, just to ground yourself where you are. Where are you listening from today? If this story resonates, stay with me and consider subscribing, because the next part unfolds softly. And that's where the real shift begins. After I was fired, nothing dramatic happened. No calls, no apologies, no sudden realization. That silence lasted longer than I expected. The first few days passed quietly. I woke up at the same time out of habit. I made coffee the way I always had. For years, my mornings had been structured around systems that never slept. Now there was no urgency, only space. I used that time to do something I hadn't done in a long while, review my own history with the company. Ravenport Technologies hadn't always been what it was now. In the early days, it was a small operation with big promises and very little structure. Back then, speed mattered more than clarity. Agreements were drafted quickly. Decisions were made to keep things moving. That's how my patent entered the picture. The platform's core logic, the part that allowed different modules to talk to each other without collapsing under load, had been my work. At the time, the company didn't want to slow down to negotiate ownership, so they proposed a temporary license instead. It's just paperwork, they said. We'll clean it up later. Later never came. Instead, the license stayed exactly as it was tied directly to my employment status. As long as I worked there, they could use it. If I didn't, the rights reverted automatically. No one ever asked to renegotiate. No one ever followed up. Over the years, people came and went. Leadership changed. The system grew more complex. My role became less visible, buried under layers of management and titles. By the time Scott Keller joined, the platform was so deeply integrated that most people believed it simply belonged to the company by default. Belief, however, isn't the same as legality. A week after my termination, I received my final confirmation letter. It restated the same phrase again, effective immediately. That wording mattered. I forwarded the letter to my attorney. a woman who specialized in intellectual property disputes and had helped me file the patent years earlier. She didn't sound surprised. They never amended the license, she said after reviewing the documents. From a legal standpoint, your rights are intact. I asked what that meant in practical terms. She paused for a moment before answering. It means they're still operating a system they no longer have permission to use. I didn't feel triumphant hearing that. I felt something quieter clarity. Because for the first time since Scott Keller smiled and dismissed me as decoration, I understood exactly where the balance of power really was, and Ravenport had no idea they were standing on borrowed ground. I didn't contact Ravenport. That part is important. I didn't send an email. I didn't make a phone call. I didn't ask for a meeting or hint at anything that might be coming. From the outside, it probably looked like I'd accepted what happened and moved on. That assumption worked in my favor. A few days after my attorney reviewed the documents, she drafted a short notice formal, precise, and unemotional. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a demand. It simply stated a fact the license tied to my patent had terminated with my employment. We didn't send it right away. Instead, we waited. Systems rarely fail all at once. They fail at the edges first, where shortcuts have been taken and assumptions go untested. About 10 days after my termination, I received the first message not from management, but from a former colleague. Hey, it read, "Quick question. Do you know why the integration service keeps restarting?" I didn't reply. The next message came 2 days later, from someone else on a different team. "Have you seen anything like this before? We're getting cascading errors, but nothing obvious is broken." Still, I stayed silent. Ravenport's platform depended on my patented framework more than anyone realized. Over the years, teams had built around it without fully understanding how it worked. When something went wrong, they fixed symptoms, not causes. Without the license, every update, every deployment, every automated process was technically unauthorized, legally invisible, but structurally vulnerable. By the third week, internal issues started leaking outward. Clients reported delays. Dashboards stopped updating in real time. Automated reports failed quietly overnight. Nothing catastrophic, just enough friction to slow everything down. Scott Keller responded the way he always did, with confidence. He blamed vendors. He blamed outdated components. He pushed the teams harder, demanding faster fixes and cleaner explanations. What he didn't do was ask the one question that mattered. He never asked whether they still had the right to use the system the way they were using it. My attorney watched the situation closely. She advised patience. Every additional day the system ran without authorization strengthened our position. Eventually, she said, we would send the notice, not to threaten them, but to inform them. And once that happened, Ravenport would have to make a choice: shut down most of their platform voluntarily, or continue operating it while knowingly exposed. Neither option would be quiet. For now, though, the silence remained, and in that silence, the cracks were spreading slowly, predictably, and entirely on their own. Observant viewers will notice something unusual here. What about you? We sent the notice on a Tuesday morning. Not early, not late, just another business hour, when people were busy enough to underestimate what they were reading. The letter was short, 3 paragraphs, no accusations, no demands. It stated that the licensing agreement tied to my patent had terminated upon my dismissal. Effective immediately, it advised Ravenport to cease use of the protected framework unless a new agreement was reached. That was it. No deadline, no ultimatums. The kind of message people ignore until they realize they can't. Scott Keller didn't call me. Instead, the legal department reached out to my attorney within the hour. They asked for clarification, as if the notice were missing something. It wasn't. They asked whether this was a misunderstanding. It wasn't. They asked whether the company could continue operating while discussions were ongoing. My attorney's response was careful. "You may choose to do so," she wrote, "but that would be a decision made with full awareness of your current legal position." The tone changed after that. By the end of the day, the internal activity at Ravenport spiked. I could tell without seeing it. Former colleagues messaged me again, more urgently this time. We're being told to document everything. Legal is asking about architecture decisions from years ago. Do you remember why this module was designed this way? I didn't respond. That evening, my attorney explained what was happening behind closed doors. Ravenport's lawyers were trying to determine how deeply my patent was embedded in the system. They already knew the answer. They just didn't like it. The framework wasn't a feature. It wasn't a plugin that could be swapped out. It was the structure that allowed the system to scale without collapsing. Removing it would mean rewriting most of the platform from the ground up, which explained why the first internal recommendation was denial. Scott Keller reportedly dismissed the notice as posturing. He believed the company could push back, delay, or intimidate its way through the situation. That belief didn't last long. Within 48 hours, a senior engineer flagged a critical issue during a routine update. The system failed to deploy cleanly. Rollbacks triggered secondary failures. Automated processes stalled. Nothing was officially down, but nothing was working the way it should. Legal intervened. Deployments were paused. Certain services were taken offline temporarily to limit exposure. What started as caution quickly turned into containment. By the end of the week, internal reports showed the same number repeated again and again, 80%. That was the portion of the platform that relied directly on my patented framework. 80% they could no longer safely touch. I didn't celebrate when I heard that. I simply acknowledged it, because the system wasn't collapsing out of spite. It was doing exactly what it had always done, responding to the rules it was built on. And this time, those rules weren't on their side. Ravenport didn't shut the system down all at once. They couldn't. Too many clients depended on it. Too many contracts were written around uptime guarantees that looked impressive on paper and unforgiving in practice. So they tried to pretend. Certain services were labeled maintenance limited. Others were routed through temporary workarounds that added seconds here, minutes there. To leadership, it looked manageable. To engineers, it looked fragile. Meetings multiplied. Documentation requests became urgent. Teams were told to decouple components without a clear plan for how. Scott Keller insisted this was temporary, according to people who were still inside. He framed it as a negotiation tactic. He believed that if Ravenport held its ground long enough, I would compromise. That, eventually. I'd want closure more than clarity. He misunderstood the situation. I didn't need anything from them. Every day, the system ran under restrictions. The company lost a little more credibility. Support tickets piled up. Service-level credits were issued quietly. Clients began asking careful questions about roadmaps, stability, and long-term support. Those questions went unanswered. Behind the scenes, legal and engineering argued constantly. Legal wanted everything frozen. Engineering warned that freezing meant falling behind. Every path forward came with consequences, and all of them traced back to the same point. They were using something they no longer had permission to use. About 3 weeks after the notice was sent, Ravenport attempted a partial workaround. A small team was tasked with rebuilding a core module without relying on my framework. The result was functional, in the narrowest sense of the word. It passed basic tests. It didn't scale. Performance degraded under load. Latency spiked. Secondary systems compensated by overworking themselves. It was a temporary fix that created permanent strain. When the data came in, it wasn't subtle. The numbers told a simple story. 80% of the platform was either offline, limited, or operating under risk controls imposed by legal. The remaining 20% worked overtime to mask the rest. That imbalance couldn't last. Scott Keller finally requested a meeting, not with me, with my attorney. The message was careful, polite. It suggested a discussion in the interest of mutual resolution. My attorney forwarded it to me without commentary. I read it once, then again. There was no apology in it, no acknowledgement of how things had been handled, just an assumption that this was a problem to be negotiated away. I told her to respond with availability, but not urgency. because by that point, Ravenport was no longer dealing with a single dispute. They were dealing with the consequences of every decision that had led them here, every shortcut, every dismissal, every moment when confidence replaced diligence. And for the first time, Scott Keller was about to realize that leverage doesn't come from titles. It comes from what still works when everything else stops. This is where careful listeners lean in. Are you still with me? The meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. Scott Keller didn't ask to see me directly. He asked for my attorney. That detail mattered more than he probably realized. They chose a neutral conference room, glass walls, minimal branding, the kind of place designed to feel calm even when nothing else is. Scott arrived late. His suit was expensive. His expression was controlled. He didn't smile this time. My attorney began by restating the facts. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't embellish. She walked through the licensing agreement line by line, the termination clause, the patent scope, and the current operational exposure. Scott listened without interrupting. When she finished, he leaned forward. "We believe there's room for interpretation," he said. "This framework has been integral to the company for years." "That's correct," my attorney replied, which is precisely why the license mattered. He shifted in his seat. The confidence he'd shown in meetings before wasn't gone, but it had changed. It was narrower now, focused, cautious. "What would it take to resolve this?" he asked. The question sounded practical, reasonable. My attorney didn't answer immediately. She asked him to clarify what he meant by resolve. Scott hesitated, then spoke carefully. "We'd like to restore full system operations," he said, "as soon as possible." There it was. Not an apology, not an acknowledgement, just a desire to make the problem disappear. My attorney nodded. That would require a new licensing agreement. Scott asked for terms. She outlined them without drama recognition of ownership, retroactive compensation, and a revised structure that reflected how deeply the framework was embedded in the platform. Scott's jaw tightened. "That's substantial," he said. "It reflects reality," she replied. He tried another approach. He spoke about teamwork, about long-term relationships, about how the company had invested in the system over time. My attorney let him finish. Then she said, "Investment doesn't replace authorization." The meeting ended without an agreement. Scott stood, thanked us for our time, and said they would review options. As he left, he glanced at me for the first time since the room began. There was no recognition in his eyes, just calculation. Later that day, my attorney told me something important. "They're running out of room," she said. "Every delay costs them more, and they know it." I didn't feel vindicated hearing that. I felt steady, because the balance had already shifted. Not because I demanded it, but because the system had reached a point where pretending was no longer an option. And Scott Keller was about to learn that some mistakes don't announce themselves loudly. They simply stop working. The first public sign came quietly. A routine status update on Ravenport's client portal changed its wording. What used to say, "Operational now," read "Limited functionality." No explanation, no apology. Just a small adjustment most users wouldn't notice at first. Internally, though, nothing was small anymore. Legal had issued strict guidelines, no new deployments, no architectural changes, no emergency fixes without review. Engineering teams were boxed in by processes designed to protect the company, not to keep the system healthy. The platform responded the only way complex systems ever do under constraint. It slowed. Jobs that once completed in seconds took minutes. Timeouts increased. Automated handoffs failed and had to be restarted manually. Every workaround created 2 new points of stress. Support tickets spiked. Clients didn't accuse. They asked questions. Careful ones. "Is this temporary? Are you still scaling as planned? Do you foresee any compliance issues sales didn't know how to answer?" Scott Keller called emergency meetings almost daily. He demanded explanations that no one could simplify. The more pressure he applied, the more defensive the teams became, Because the truth was uncomfortable. They weren't dealing with a bug. They were dealing with an absence. The absence of legal permission. One afternoon, a major client requested a formal assurance letter confirming Ravenport's right to operate the platform as contracted. Legal stalled, drafts circulated, nothing was sent. That silence didn't go unnoticed. Within days, another client paused expansion plans. Then another delayed renewal discussions. Not cancellations yet, just hesitation. Hesitation spreads. By the end of the month, Ravenport's leadership had a number they couldn't ignore. 80%. That was the portion of the system either restricted, degraded, or under legal hold. 80% of their value proposition was operating under uncertainty. Scott Keller stopped dismissing the issue. He stopped talking about interpretation. He started asking for timelines. How long until we can replace it? How fast can we rebuild? What would it take to own it outright? The answers weren't what he wanted. Rebuilding would take years. Buying outright required agreement. And agreement required acknowledging something he'd never acknowledged before. That the pretty face he'd dismissed had been holding the structure together the entire time. I didn't attend those meetings. I didn't need updates. My attorney kept me informed in simple terms. They're escalating, she said. But escalation doesn't solve structural problems. She was right. Ravenport hadn't lost control because of a lawsuit or a dramatic shutdown. They were losing it because systems don't respond to confidence. They respond to design, and the design they depended on no longer belonged to them. The second meeting felt different before it even started. Scott Keller arrived early this time. No phone, no casual posture. He sat straight, hands folded on the table, as if discipline alone could restore order. Legal was present now. Two of them. Quiet. Watchful. My attorney didn't change her tone. She didn't need to. Scott spoke first. We've assessed the situation, he said. The company can't continue operating under these constraints. That wasn't a revelation. It was an admission. He talked about responsibility, about employees, about clients who depended on Ravenport's services. He framed it as stewardship, not damage control. When he finished, my attorney asked one question. Are you acknowledging that the platform cannot legally operate without a valid license? Scott hesitated. Just long enough. Yes, he said. The room went still. That sentence did more than any argument ever could. It collapsed months of denial into a single point of truth. My attorney slid a revised proposal across the table. It wasn't new. It was the same framework as before: ownership recognition, compensation, long-term licensing with clear boundaries. Scott read it slowly this time. He didn't call it unreasonable. He called it difficult. I didn't realize how much depended on it, he said finally. The statement landed awkwardly, not because it was false, but because it was too late. My attorney responded evenly. That's not uncommon. Critical systems often become invisible once they're stable. Scott looked at me then. Really looked. There was something different in his expression. Not remorse, not respect. Recognition, for the first time. He understood that the balance of power hadn't shifted recently. It had always been this way. He'd just never seen it. We need this resolved quickly, he said. Every day costs us more. My attorney nodded. Then we'll need commitment, not intent. The meeting ended with a timeline, not a handshake, not an agreement, outside the room. My attorney explained the next phase. They're boxed in, she said. They can't replace it. They can't operate without it. And now they've acknowledged that fact on record. That mattered. Because from that moment forward, Ravenport wasn't just exposed, they were aware. And awareness changes everything, especially when 80% of your system is no longer something you control. Scott Keller left that building knowing something he hadn't known before. That confidence doesn't override structure, and titles don't fix what was never legally yours. The shift from private crisis to public consequence happened faster than anyone expected. It started with a disclosure. Ravenport's legal team advised leadership that certain enterprise clients would need to be notified of material operational constraints. The language was careful, but the implication was not. Contracts required transparency when risks crossed a specific threshold. That threshold had been crossed weeks ago. The first notice went out on a Thursday afternoon. By Friday morning, account managers were fielding calls they couldn't deflect. Clients weren't angry. They were precise. Are you still authorized to operate the platform? Does this impact compliance guarantees? Is our data at risk? Those questions had answers. None of them were simple. Scott Keller convened an emergency board session. For the first time since the issue began, his father attended. He listened more than he spoke, flipping through printed reports, with a stillness that made the room uncomfortable. 80%. The number appeared everywhere: slides, memos, risk matrices. 80% of services constrained. 80% of revenue touched by the affected systems. 80% of the roadmap frozen. The board didn't argue about causes. They argued about timing. How did we not know? Why wasn't this escalated? Who approved operating without a valid license? The answers pointed inward. Legal acknowledged the oversight. Engineering described the dependency. HR referenced the termination paperwork. Every department had touched the problem without seeing the whole. Scott Keller spoke last. He tried to frame it as an inherited issue, a legacy gap, a technical misunderstanding that had grown larger than expected. No one challenged him directly. They didn't need to. The facts did that on their own. By Monday, 2 major clients paused new deployments. One requested an exit clause review. Another demanded a third-party audit before proceeding further. Ravenport's valuation took a hit before any announcement was made. Investors read between lines. Analysts noticed the language change in public-facing materials. Silence, at that scale, becomes its own signal. My attorney called me that evening. They've authorized settlement authority, she said. Full authority. That was the clearest indicator yet. Not because it meant agreement was guaranteed, but because it meant denial was over. Scott Keller reached out again. This time directly. The message was brief, controlled. He asked if I would be willing to attend the final discussion. I agreed. Not out of curiosity, not for closure, but because this phase wasn't about leverage anymore. It was about accountability. Ravenport had reached the point where systems, contracts, and reputations intersected. There was no workaround left to hide behind. What came next wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be dramatic. It would be formal, recorded, and irreversible. And for the first time since I walked out of that building with my badge turned off, the consequences were no longer theoretical. They were documented. The final meeting didn't feel like a confrontation. It felt like an inventory. Who owned what? Who was responsible for what? What could still be saved and what couldn't? Scott Keller sat across from me without speaking for a long moment. No jokes, no casual confidence. Just a man reading the outcome of his own decisions in real time. The agreement was finalized that afternoon. Ravenport acknowledged my ownership of the patent. They paid retroactive licensing fees less than the system had earned, but enough to make the point unmistakable. A new, limited license was granted, tightly scoped, time-bound, and auditable. 80% of the system came back online gradually, not because it was fixed, but because it was finally authorized again. By then, the damage was already done. 2 clients never resumed expansion. One quietly exited 6 months later. The board restructured leadership. Scott Keller kept his title, but not his autonomy. Oversight replaced confidence. No announcement was made about me. There didn't need to be, in systems like this. Attribution doesn't matter nearly as much as continuity. What mattered was that the platform no longer pretended it owned what it had borrowed. As for me, I didn't return to Ravenport. I didn't want a role. I didn't want recognition. I wanted distance. I took my time. I reviewed offers carefully. For the first time in years, I worked on my own terms. Occasionally, someone would ask if I felt vindicated. I didn't. Vindication implies emotion. This had been procedural. What stayed with me wasn't anger, it was clarity. Scott Keller never apologized, not directly, but months later, through a third party. I heard he'd asked a question he'd never asked before. What systems do we rely on that we don't fully understand? That question mattered more than any apology ever could. Because the truth is, I was never just a pretty face. I was the person who made sure things worked when no one was watching, the person who documented, protected, and planned for what came after confidence ran out. This story isn't about revenge. It's about ownership. It's about structure. It's about what happens when someone mistakes visibility for value. Systems don't care who sits at the head of the table. They care about rules, permissions, and design. And when those are ignored long enough, even 80% can stop quietly, lawfully, and completely. When everything finally went quiet, I didn't feel victorious. I felt present. I remember sitting alone at my desk that night, the room dim, the hum of the city outside, realizing that what saved me wasn't anger or bravado, it was preparation. Real value isn't loud. It's built patiently, often unnoticed, until the moment it's needed most. Being dismissed taught me something deeply human. Dignity doesn't come from how others see you, but from knowing what you carry when no one is watching. I learned that protecting your work, your time, and your boundaries isn't selfish, it's respect for your own life. If you're still here with me, thank you. Did you stay until the end because some part of this felt familiar? Have you ever been underestimated, quietly holding everything together while someone else took credit? If you're comfortable, I'd love to hear your story. Where are you listening from right now? If this moment resonated with you, please leave a comment. It helps more people find these stories. A like or a share might help someone else feel less alone. And if you want to stay with us for more real, human stories like this, consider subscribing. We're just getting started. Together.